The vampire king stood frozen outside the kitchen door, watching his deaf twins mirror a maid's spinning movements in perfect rhythm. Everyone thought the twins were unteachable, but here they were signing jokes, fingers blurring between dance steps and laughter he'd never heard before. Only then did he notice the flower patterns on the floor, deliberate symbols his court sorceress had warned were wards against blood magic, drawn by a servant who shouldn't know they existed. Cassius Thornvale had seen 8 centuries pass like water through his fingers, had witnessed empires rise and crumble into forgotten dust, had held his dying wife as her blood pooled on marble floors, while her murderers fled into darkness. And yet nothing in all those endless years had prepared him for the sound of his children laughing. He stood motionless in the corridor outside the palace kitchens at 3 in the morning, one hand pressed against the cool stone wall, listening to a sound he had not heard in decades and was not entirely certain he recognized. The palace around him slept in that peculiar silence unique to vampire strongholds, a quiet so profound it seemed to have weight and texture, broken only by the distant footfalls of guards making their rounds and the whisper of wind through arrow slits. But from behind the heavy oak door before him came something else entirely. The bright, unguarded laughter of children, muffled but unmistakable, and beneath it the soft rhythm of bare feet moving across stone floors. Cassius felt something twist in his chest, something he had thought long dead, and for a moment he could not decide whether to flee or to investigate. 847 years of existence had taught him caution, had taught him that joy was often a mask for danger, had taught him that everything beautiful eventually turned to ash. 200 years ago he had learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible when Elena's warm hand had gone cold in his, and he had understood, finally and irrevocably, that immortality meant watching everything mortal die. He wore that understanding now like armor, like a second skin, visible in the set of his shoulders and the carefully controlled neutrality of his expression. But the laughter continued, rising and falling like music, and curiosity won over caution as it so rarely did anymore. He pushed the door open slowly, careful to make no sound, and stepped into the vast palace kitchen that had once been Elena's favorite room in all the sprawling fortress. Moonlight poured through the high arched windows, transforming the ordinary into something ethereal, catching on the flower dust that hung in the air like snow, and making the copper pots that lined the walls gleam like captured stars. The smell hit him next: yeast and warmth, cinnamon and cardamom, the rich golden scent of rising dough that carried with it memories so vivid they nearly drove him back into the corridor. But he stood his ground and looked, really looked, at the scene before him. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from. And what time is it? It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. His children, Alara and Rowan, frozen forever at 12 years old, though they had lived in that state for 150 years, were dancing. There was no other word for it. They moved in perfect synchronization, their hands shaping signs he had never seen before, their bodies spinning and swaying in patterns that seemed part conversation and part ritual. And with them, matching their movements with a grace that spoke of careful study and natural aptitude, was the new kitchen maid, whose name he thought was Isla something or other. Hired a week ago through the normal channels and utterly unremarkable until this moment. She wore the simple gray uniform of palace servants, flour dusted across her dark hair and smudged on one cheek, and she moved with a fluidity that belied her station. Cassius watched as Rowan shaped his hands into the curve of a fox's ears, his fingers flickering to suggest cunning and speed, while Ilara responded with the sharp angles of a raven's wings, and the maid, Isla, mirrored both signs in rapid succession, laughing as she stumbled over a particularly complex gesture. They were telling a story, he realized, using their bodies and hands to create a narrative as vivid as any spoken tale. And the maid was not just learning their language, but participating in it, adding her own flourishes and interpretations. His court sorceress Mira had warned him 3 months ago about a possible blood curse, had shown him protective sigils that could ward against such magic, had urged him to increase security around his person and his household. He had listened with half his attention, accustomed to threats after so many centuries of rule, and had filed the information away as something to address when time permitted. But now, looking down at the kitchen floor, he saw those exact sigils drawn in flour, precise and deliberate, forming a protective circle around the three dancers. The symbols were complex, requiring both magical knowledge and careful execution, and they were absolutely identical to the ones Mira had shown him. A kitchen maid should not know such things. A kitchen maid hired through normal channels should not be able to draw wards that even most trained sorcerers would struggle to replicate. Every instinct Cassius had honed over 8 centuries screamed at him to summon his guards, to detain this woman immediately, to have her questioned and investigated until he understood exactly who and what she was. But even as these thoughts formed, Alara and Rowan looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, and their faces transformed with a joy so pure and unguarded that it stopped his breath. They rushed toward him, hands outstretched, grabbing his fingers and trying to pull him into their circle, and he realized with a shock that sent tremors through his entire body that this was the first time in decades they had voluntarily touched him. He had tried, in the century and a half since they had been turned, to reach his children. He had hired tutors from across the 7 territories, had commissioned scholars to develop new teaching methods, had learned basic sign language himself in an attempt to bridge the gap that seemed to widen with each passing year. Every attempt had ended in failure. The tutors had quit one after another, each claiming that the twins were unreachable, unteachable, locked in a world he could never access. He had watched his children retreat further into silence, had seen them develop their own private language of gestures and glances that excluded everyone else, had felt the weight of his failure as a father grow heavier with each passing decade. They barely looked at him anymore, barely acknowledged his presence, except when protocol demanded it, and he had accepted this as the price of his choices, as yet another loss to add to the growing catalogue of things immortality had cost him. But now they were pulling at his hands, their fingers warm and insistent, their faces bright with excitement, and behind them the maid stood watching with an expression he could not quite read. She turned fully toward him then, and instead of dropping into the terrified bow he expected from servants caught doing something irregular, she simply looked at him and signed with her hands. "Good morning, Your Majesty." The signs were formal court gesture, the kind used in official ceremonies and diplomatic functions, executed with perfect precision. He had not known she could sign at all, let alone in the formal style that took years of study to master. The wrongness of the situation intensified, but so did something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. Every protocol he had established over centuries of rule demanded that he remove this woman immediately, that he have her detained and questioned until he understood the full extent of her knowledge and intentions. The protective wards alone were reason enough for suspicion. The fact that she could apparently teach his supposedly unteachable children in the space of a week was even more alarming. And yet his children were touching him, smiling at him, trying to include him in their world for the first time in living memory, and he found he could not bear to be the one to end this moment. He made his decision and stepped into the kitchen, letting Alara and Rowan pull him toward the flower circle, feeling the protective wards tingle against his skin as he crossed their boundary. The kitchen wrapped around him like memory made solid. 200 years ago, Elena had taught him to dance in this very room, had laughed at his stiffness, and insisted that a king should know how to move with joy as well as dignity, had spun him around between the prep tables while the night kitchen staff pretended not to notice. She had been so alive, so impossibly vibrant, every moment with her blazing with an intensity that made immortality seem dull by comparison. And then the hunters had come, The Renwick clan with their blessed silver and their ancient hatred, and they had taken her from him in a spray of blood and screaming, and he had sealed this kitchen in his memory as a place too painful to revisit. But here he was, and here were his children, and here was this mysterious maid who somehow carried Elena's recipes and drew protective wards and made his children laugh. Isla spoke then, her voice soft but clear, her hands moving in sign even as her lips shaped words. "Have you eaten today, Your Majesty? The twins wanted to make you cinnamon bread." The question was so unexpected, so domestic and caring, that for a moment he could not process it. When had anyone last asked if he had eaten, if he had rested, if he had taken care of himself? He was the vampire king of the Covenant of Seven Territories. People brought him problems and waited for solutions. They brought him threats and waited for judgment. They brought him their ambitions and their fears and their endless political maneuvering. But no one asked if he had eaten. He realized with a strange, distant clarity that he was being cared for rather than manipulated, and the sensation was so unfamiliar that he had no framework for understanding it. He looked at the maid, at Isla Renwick, the name suddenly swimming up from the personnel reports he signed without really reading, and saw something in her eyes that might have been compassion, or might have been calculation, or might have been both. He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice, and watched as she smiled and turned back to the preparation table where dough was rising in a wooden bowl. His children, his beautiful lost children, took his hands again and guided him to the scarred wooden table where he had sat with Elena so many times, and he let himself be led. He sat, and they released him to help Isla with the bread, their movements coordinated and purposeful in a way that spoke of practice and routine. How long had this been happening? How many nights had they slipped down to this kitchen to learn from this woman while he sat alone in his study, drowning in paperwork and loneliness? Cassius watched Isla's hands as she worked the dough, kneading it with practiced efficiency, and noticed the calluses. They were in the wrong places for kitchen work. Her palms showed the marks of someone who had wielded weapons or tools, not mixing spoons and rolling pins. The evidence of deception was mounting, and yet he found himself reluctant to act on it. Perhaps he was getting old in spirit, if not in body. Perhaps 2 centuries of grief had finally worn away his better judgment. Or perhaps he simply wanted, for one night, to sit in this kitchen and watch his children smile and pretend that some things could be repaired. Dawn was creeping toward the high windows, turning the moonlight pale and thin, and Cassius knew that in 30 minutes the day kitchen staff would arrive and this strange pocket of time would shatter. He leaned back in his chair and let himself exist in the moment, breathing in the scent of cinnamon and watching flour dust spiral in the early light, and tried not to think about what came next. The bread baked, filling the kitchen with warmth and fragrance, and when Isla pulled it from the oven and set it before him, he looked at the golden brown loaf and felt something in his chest crack open. He had not eaten human food in 200 years. Vampires could consume it but did not need to. And after Elena's death, the taste of ordinary food had seemed like an insult to her memory. But his children were watching him with such hope, such naked vulnerability, that he reached out and tore off a piece of the still hot bread and brought it to his mouth. The taste exploded across his tongue, cinnamon and honey and cardamom, butter and warmth, and something indefinably perfect. It tasted exactly, precisely, impossibly like the bread Elena used to make on quiet mornings when the palace slept and they could pretend to be ordinary people living ordinary lives. His hands began to shake, bread crumbling between his fingers, and he stared at Isla with something approaching horror. "Where did you learn protective wards, Miss Renwick?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he could not quite control. She met his gaze steadily, no trace of fear in her expression, and answered with what he suspected was calculated honesty. "My grandmother was a hedge witch in the borderlands. She taught me to bake and to protect what I bake from spoiling, magical and otherwise." It was a reasonable explanation, almost plausible, and yet it did not account for the formal court sign, or the precise replication of Elena's recipe, or the way his children had bonded to her in the space of a week. Before he could press further, Elara and Rowan moved to stand between him and Isla, their hands flying in rapid sign, too fast for him to follow completely, but clear enough in intent. "She's ours," they signed. "She's ours, and you can't disappear her like the others." The others. Cassius felt ice crystallize in his veins. What others? He had approved every tutor personally, had reviewed their credentials and their references, had given explicit instructions that they were to be treated well and given every resource they needed. If they had quit, it was because they had chosen to quit, except that was not what his children were telling him. They were telling him that tutors had been disappeared, removed without explanation, and the only person with the authority to do that without his direct knowledge was his steward, Lord Osric Vane, who had served him faithfully for 3 centuries and whom he trusted implicitly. Why would Osric sabotage his children's education? What possible motive could he have? The questions multiplied in his mind, but before he could voice them, Isla spoke again, her tone thoughtful. "Your Majesty, have you noticed the blind spot in the corner there, where the servants' corridor connects? Someone could enter and exit this kitchen unseen from the main hallways. Someone's been using it." She pointed, and Cassius followed her gesture to a shadowed corner he had walked past 1,000 times without really seeing. She was right. The angle of the walls created a perfect blind spot, invisible from the main entrance and from the windows. Anyone who knew the palace well enough could use the lower corridors to access this kitchen without being observed. The implications made his mind race with possibilities, none of them comforting. He was about to stand, about to order a full investigation of the servants' corridors and the security protocols, when Elara touched his arm gently and offered him another piece of bread. The simple gesture stopped him. He took the bread and ate it, and tasted memory and loss, and something that might have been healing. Isla watched him with those dark, knowing eyes and asked softly, "That's Queen Elena's morning bread, isn't it? The recipe was supposed to be lost when she died." "How do you know that name?" Cassius demanded, his voice sharp with sudden suspicion and grief. Isla did not flinch from his tone. She answered steadily, "My grandmother worked in the palace kitchens during Queen Elena's time. She kept a hidden recipe book, wrote down everything the queen taught her. I inherited it 6 months ago when my grandmother died. That's why I came to the palace, to see where the recipes were born, to understand the woman who created them." Cassius examined her with every sense he possessed. Her heartbeat remained steady, her breathing even, her micro-expressions consistent with truthfulness. She was not lying, or if she was better at deception than anyone he had encountered in 8 centuries. And yet, there was something she was not telling him, some crucial piece of information she was holding back. He could sense the omission like a gap in a tapestry, present by its very absence. He should detain her. He should have her questioned thoroughly. He should at minimum remove her from contact with his children until he understood exactly who and what she was. But even as these thoughts formed, he heard Elena's voice in his memory, warm and slightly exasperated. "You're so busy protecting yourself from danger that you can't recognize help when it arrives. Trust someone, Cassius. Trust something." He made another decision that protocol would condemn. "I'm offering you a position," he said carefully, "as the twins' companion and tutor. 3-month trial period. You'll live in the family wing, not the servants' quarters. The pay will be generous." Isla tilted her head, considering, and then countered with words that shocked him to his core. "I'll accept on one condition. You take 1 meal with us daily. The twins need to see you as a father, not just a king." No one had dictated terms to him in centuries. Kings did not negotiate with servants. The hierarchies of power were absolute and unquestionable. And yet, here was this woman, this mysterious maid with her protective wards and her impossible knowledge, telling him what his children needed and making her acceptance conditional on his compliance. He should have been furious. Instead, he found himself fighting the urge to laugh. Before he could respond, Ilara and Rowan both signed simultaneously, their hands shaping the words with desperate hope. Please, Father. It was the first time they had called him father in 50 years. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and precious, and Cassius felt the last of his resistance crumble. I accept your terms, he said quietly. The kitchen door opened and Lord Osric Vane entered, his expression smoothing from fury to concern so quickly that anyone less observant might have missed the transition. Your Majesty, Osric said, his voice perfectly calibrated to suggest worried propriety. You shouldn't be in the servants' areas without guards. Cassius had been in this kitchen 1,000 times over the centuries. Osric had never once expressed concern about it. The inconsistency registered like a warning bell, and Cassius filed it away for later examination. He watched as Osric's eyes moved to Isla, and lingered there with something that might have been recognition, though Isla's expression showed nothing but polite neutrality. Miss Renwick has accepted a position as companion and tutor to my children, Cassius announced, making his voice carry the weight of royal decree. She'll be moving to the family wing today. Prepare the necessary arrangements. Osric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he bowed low. Of course, Your Majesty, as you command. He retreated from the kitchen, his movements controlled and graceful, and Cassius noticed that the flower symbols on the floor, those protective wards that had been so carefully drawn, were now smudged and broken where someone had walked through them during the conversation. Someone who had not been there when Cassius entered. Someone who had used the blind spot Isla had pointed out. He looked at his children, at their faces bright with hope and joy, and at Isla, who met his gaze with steady calm, and wondered what exactly he had just set in motion. The sun was rising over the palace walls, painting the kitchen in shades of gold and amber, and Cassius sat at the scarred wooden table where he had last been happy 200 years ago and let himself believe just for a moment that some things lost could be found again. Morning arrived with all the subtle violence of court politics, and Isla Renwick found herself standing in a suite of rooms that were larger than any dwelling she had ever occupied, surrounded by servants who whispered behind their hands and stared with eyes that ranged from curious to hostile. The rooms were adjacent to the twins' chambers, connected by a door that Ilara and Rowan had already discovered and propped open with a brass doorstop shaped like a sleeping cat, and the walls were papered in pale blue silk that caught the light like water. Isla's few possessions looked absurd in the vast space. Her grandmother's recipe book, a change of clothes, the simple gray uniform she had worn in the kitchens, now replaced by clothing in deep green that marked her as part of the royal household rather than general staff. The transformation from kitchen maid to companion and tutor had taken less than 12 hours, and the speed of it had set tongues wagging throughout the palace. She could feel the weight of speculation and judgment pressing against her from all sides, could sense the careful recalibration of social hierarchies as servants tried to determine where exactly she fit in the complex web of palace relationships. The whispers followed her as she moved through the corridors, fragments of gossip that she was not supposed to hear, but that carried clearly enough. Common girl elevated above her station, king's new favorite, probably warming his bed already. Those poor children used as an excuse. How long before she's cast aside like all the others? Isla kept her face neutral and her steps measured, but each whispered word landed like a small cut, death by 1,000 insinuations. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Daventry, made her disapproval known through the particular torture of petty obstacles executed with perfect plausible deniability. The morning bathwater arrived cold, an oversight surely. These things happen in such a large palace. The breakfast tray came with foods Isla had mentioned disliking in casual conversation. A coincidence, of course. How could the kitchens have known? The schedule for the twins' lessons arrived an hour late, misplaced in the confusion of the transition, entirely understandable given how sudden the arrangement was. Mrs. Daventry was 300 years old, a vampire of rigid propriety and absolute loyalty to Lord Osric Vane, and she made each minor inconvenience feel like a precisely aimed arrow. Isla endured it with outward calm, understanding that this was a test, a way of establishing dominance and determining whether the upstart kitchen maid would crack under pressure or hold her ground. She held her ground, and by mid-morning when she entered the twins' study room, she had already made 3 quiet enemies and 0 allies among the household staff. The study room was flooded with light from tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, and Cassius had clearly spared no expense in preparing it for his children's education. The walls were lined with books adapted for visual learning, their pages filled with illustrations and diagrams. Mathematical concepts were represented with physical objects, beads for counting, wooden shapes for geometry, colored stones for demonstrating patterns. Historical texts came with maps and timelines that could be touched and manipulated. Literature was accompanied by beautifully illustrated editions, where the pictures told as much of the story as the words. It was a library designed by someone who desperately wanted to reach his children and had thrown resources at the problem without understanding that resources alone could not bridge the gap of connection. Alara and Rowan were waiting for her, bouncing slightly with barely contained energy, their hands already moving in sign to ask what they would learn today, whether she would teach them more stories, whether father would really come for lunch as he had promised. Isla smiled and began to transform the rigorous academic schedule Cassius had prepared into something altogether different. History became a dance, where each movement represented a different historical figure, where battles were choreographed as dueling partners, where the rise and fall of kingdoms could be traced in the arc of bodies through space. Mathematics turned into a game of patterns and prediction, signs flowing into calculations, the rhythm of fingers counting beats matching the rhythm of feet marking time. Literature became theater, stories acted out with exaggerated expressions and sweeping gestures. Characters brought to life through movement and sign until the twins were not just reading about heroes and villains, but embodying them. The twins absorbed information like dry earth soaking up rain, ravenous for knowledge now that it came in a form they could access, and Isla watched their faces light with understanding and felt something fierce and protective bloom in her chest. These children were not unteachable. They had simply been taught by people who could not see past their own assumptions about what learning should look like. By the time noon arrived, all 3 of them were flushed and laughing. The study room transformed into a stage where historical dramas and mathematical puzzles had played out with equal enthusiasm. Isla was in the middle of demonstrating how a particular battle formation worked when the door opened and Cassius entered, stiff and formal in his dark official robes, looking as comfortable as a man approaching his own execution. The twins rushed to him immediately, grabbing his hands and pulling him toward the table that had been set for lunch in the conservatory adjoining the study room. The conservatory was all glass and greenery, filled with plants that thrived in indirect sunlight and the carefully controlled temperature that magic and architecture made possible. Lunch was laid out on a table of polished oak, bread and cheese, fruit and cold meats, dishes that could be eaten without elaborate preparation or formal service. Cassius sat and his children sat across from him, and Isla took a seat at the end of the table feeling like an intruder in a family moment, even though she had been explicitly invited. For several long, awkward minutes, Cassius attempted conversation in the only way he knew how, discussing military strategy and territorial politics with the twins, explaining recent developments in border negotiations with the kind of detail that might interest seasoned diplomats, but left 2 12-year-old children staring at him with blank incomprehension. Isla watched him struggle, watched him reach for connection using the only tools he had, the language of kingship and command, and finally she intervened gently. "Your Majesty," she said, using a bowl of berries and several pieces of bread to create a makeshift stage, "would you tell Alara and Rowan about their mother? Use these to show us the people." Cassius looked at her with something approaching panic, and for a moment she thought he would refuse, would retreat behind the walls of formality and protocol. But then Elara touched his hand, a feather-light brush of fingers, and he swallowed hard and began. He picked up a small round berry, turning it between his fingers, and said this was Elena, and she was terrible at sitting still during state dinners. He used pieces of bread to represent himself and various courtiers, and with hesitant movements, he showed how Elena used to steal food from his plate when she thought no one was looking, how she would make faces at him across the table during particularly boring diplomatic sessions, how she had once smuggled a kitten into a formal banquet in her sleeve. The twins watched with absolute attention, their eyes fixed on their father's face as he spoke about their mother, and when he demonstrated how Elena used to steal berries from his plate with exaggerated stealth, both children giggled, the sound bright and unguarded. Cassius nearly smiled, the expression flickering across his face before he caught it and tucked it away, but Isla saw it and marked it as a small victory. Elara's hands moved then, shaping a question with careful deliberation. "Did Mother dance with you?" The question hung in the air, and Isla watched Cassius's expression close down, watched him retreat into that careful neutrality that served as armor against feeling too much. He answered quietly, admitting that he had been a terrible dancer, that Elena had been patient beyond reason, that she had insisted a king should know how to move with grace and not just command it, that he missed her every single day, and dancing without her felt like desecration. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, centuries of control fracturing just enough to let real emotion through. Rowan signed then, his small hands forming the request with heartbreaking hope. "Teach us to dance like Mother did." Cassius stood so quickly, his chair scraped against the floor, his whole body going rigid with barely controlled panic. He made some excuse about state meetings, urgent business that could not wait, apologies for cutting lunch short, and fled the conservatory with all the dignity he could muster, but unmistakable haste nonetheless. The twins' faces crumpled, and Isla moved immediately to gather them close, holding them as they cried silent tears into her shoulders. She signed to them with one hand, while the other rubbed soothing circles on their backs. Grief takes time, even for immortal fathers. He loves you. He's just forgotten how to show it. Give him time. They clung to her, and she let them, understanding that this was part of healing too, the crying and the disappointment, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding trust. After the twins had settled for their afternoon rest, exhausted from the morning's intensive learning and the emotional turbulence of lunch, Isla found herself drawn to the palace library, a vast collection of books and scrolls that occupied an entire wing of the ancient fortress. She told herself she was researching Thornvale history to better teach the children, to understand the context of the kingdom they would someday help rule, but the truth was darker and more specific. She was looking for information about the Renwick clan, about the hunters who had killed Queen Elena, about whether her grandmother's story of shame and penance was the whole truth, or just the version that had been safe to tell a child. The library was a labyrinth of knowledge, shelves reaching toward vaulted ceilings, narrow walkways between towers of books, the smell of old paper and leather bindings thick in the air. Isla wandered through it until she found the section on recent history, the past few centuries of covenant politics and conflicts, and from there, she followed references until she located the portrait gallery, a long hall where the faces of the royal family stared down from their frames with varying degrees of warmth and severity. She found Elena halfway down the gallery and stopped breathing. The portrait showed a woman perhaps 30 years old, human and mortal and impossibly vibrant even in paint and canvas. Her hair was dark and woven through with flowers, her eyes kind and intelligent, her smile suggesting she had just heard something amusing and was deciding whether to share the joke. She wore a simple gown in blue and silver, her hands folded loosely in her lap, and everything about her radiated a warmth that made Isla understand immediately why Cassius had loved her. why he had never recovered from her loss. The notation on the frame was brief and brutal. Queen Elena Thornville, beloved wife and mother, murdered by the Renwick Hunter clan, year 647 of Covenant. May her memory be eternal, and her killers be cursed. Isla felt the world tilt sideways. Her hand went to her collar, where her surname was sewn into the fabric of her new uniform, and she whispered, "No, no, no," like a prayer that could somehow change the past. She had known her grandmother's brother had done something terrible, had known the family carried shame, but seeing it written so plainly, seeing the date and the accusation and the beautiful face of the woman her blood had helped destroy, made it real in a way that stories never had. She stood frozen before the portrait, ice spreading through her veins, and did not hear the approach of footsteps behind her. "You didn't know you shared the hunter's name, did you, child?" The voice was warm and knowing, and Isla spun to find a woman watching her with eyes that saw too much. Court sorceress Mira was ageless in the way of powerful magic users, her face unlined but her gaze carrying the weight of centuries, her robes embroidered with symbols that shifted and changed when looked at directly. She had been watching Isla all day, she explained, had seen the morning lessons and the lunch disaster, and had followed the new tutor to the library out of curiosity and growing certainty. She was a seer among other things, could read the threads of fate and probability, and she knew that Isla Renwick was not a threat to the royal family, but that she carried a legacy as dangerous as any blade. "The king will discover it eventually," Mira said gently, her hand coming to rest on Isla's shoulder with surprising warmth. "Tell him yourself before Osric does. Lord Vane is already searching for ways to discredit you, and this connection to the hunters is exactly the kind of ammunition he needs. If Cassius hears it from Osric first, framed as betrayal and infiltration, he will have no choice but to act against you. But if you tell him yourself, honestly and completely, he may find it in himself to separate you from your ancestors' crimes." Isla's mind raced through possibilities and consequences. Revealing her surname could destroy the fragile trust she had built with Cassius, could end her contract immediately, could hurt the twins who had already bonded to her. But hiding it was a betrayal of a different kind, a lie of omission that would poison everything if discovered later. She was trapped between two bad choices, and the walls seemed to be closing in. She thanked Mira quietly and left the library, walking through the palace in a daze, barely seeing the corridors and courtyards she passed. Evening came, and with it dinner, another meal in the conservatory with Cassius and the twins. But Isla was quiet, her responses subdued, her usual energy dampened by the weight of what she now knew. Cassius noticed, his ancient eyes tracking her with concern, but he did not press, and the meal passed in awkward near silence broken only by the twins' attempts at conversation. After the children had been put to bed, after their routine of stories and settling and good-night signs had been completed, Isla found herself drawn back to the kitchen where all of this had started. The vast room was empty and dark, illuminated only by moonlight through the high windows, and she moved through it like a ghost visiting haunted ground. She drew new wards in flower on the floor, protective symbols that had become habit and comfort, and whispered a prayer to her grandmother's memory. "Help me know what to do. Help me protect these children. Help me not destroy everything I touch." She did not notice the shadow in the blind spot corner, did not see the figure that watched her with cold calculation, and then slipped away to send a message via Raven to some unknown recipient outside the palace walls. 3 days passed in a blur of intensive teaching and growing attachment. Isla and the twins established rhythms and routines, inside jokes in sign language and shared references that made them a unit, a small family within the larger structure of the royal household. The twins' learning accelerated beyond anyone's expectations, their minds sharp and hungry once given information in forms they could grasp. Palace gossip buzzed with speculation about the mysterious new tutor and her seemingly magical ability to reach the unreachable children, and opinions divided sharply between those who saw her as a miracle and those who suspected darker motives. The weekly council meeting brought tensions to a head. Cassius sat at the head of a long table surrounded by representatives from the 7 territories, vampire lords with their own agendas and alliances, and Lord Osric Vane presented his concerns with the smooth efficiency of long practice. An anonymous report had surfaced, he explained with perfect professional neutrality, suggesting that the new tutor Isla Renwick might have connections to subversive groups that opposed the Covenant. Evidence had been found, a letter allegedly discovered in her rooms that mentioned completing her grandmother's final wish and entering the palace under false pretenses. Osric read selected passages aloud, his voice carefully stripped of inflection, letting the words themselves carry the weight of accusation. Cassius listened with growing anger, not at Ela but at the transparent manipulation. The letter was clearly about honoring recipes and memories, about seeing the place where her grandmother had worked and loved, but Osric framed it as conspiracy and infiltration, and several council members nodded along with grave concern. The steward suggested, with appropriate reluctance, that perhaps the 3-month trial should be ended early for the children's safety, that the risk of keeping someone with questionable loyalties so close to the royal heirs was simply too great to ignore. The council divided predictably, Osric's political allies supporting his position, while others pointed to the twins' remarkable progress and argued that results spoke louder than anonymous accusations. Cassius made his decision with the authority of absolute rule. Investigation would proceed, but Ela would remain unless actual proof of threat emerged, and he would personally oversee the inquiry to ensure fairness. The meeting adjourned in tense silence, and Cassius summoned Isla to his study immediately afterward. The study was all dark wood and leather, towering bookshelves filled with centuries of accumulated knowledge. A massive desk that served as command center for ruling 7 territories. Elena's portrait hung on the wall, her painted eyes seeming to watch everything that happened in the room, and Isla felt the weight of that gaze as she stood before the desk while Cassius questioned her with formal precision. "What was your grandmother's final wish, Miss Renwick?" Isla could have deflected, could have given partial truths and careful omissions, but something in her rebelled against more deception. She told him everything, her grandmother's dying words about seeing where the light lived before the hunters took it, about maybe being able to return some of what was stolen, about the shame that had haunted Marta Renwick all her life. And when Cassius asked what she meant by hunters, Isla made her choice. She confessed the connection to the clan that had killed Elena, watched his face go absolutely still as the information registered, watched his eyes flash red with vampire rage barely controlled, felt the temperature in the room drop as ancient power leaked through his careful control. She showed him the recipe book with trembling hands, opened it to reveal the inscription on the inside cover. To Elena, who taught a kitchen girl that magic is love made visible. Marta Renwick, ashamed of my brother's crimes. The words were in faded ink, written in an elegant hand that Cassius recognized immediately as his dead wife's. Isla explained quickly, words tumbling over each other. Her grandmother had been sister to one of the hunters, had stayed at the palace as penance, had protected Elena's memory through recipes, had carried guilt until it killed her. Cassius moved to his archives with mechanical precision, pulled out employment records from 2 centuries ago, found confirmation. Marta Renwick, kitchen staff, employed during Elena's reign, left shortly after the Queen's death, took nothing but a single recipe book that Elena had given her as a gift. The documentation was there, the proof of her grandmother's loyalty and subsequent exile, but Cassius stood reading it with his back to Isla, and she could not see his face. When he finally turned, his expression was a war between rage at the surname and recognition of the evidence, between the desire for vengeance and the reality that this woman before him had done nothing but care for his children and honor his wife's memory. "I'll leave tonight if you command it," Isla said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror racing through her. "But please let me say goodbye to Alara and Rowan." The study door burst open before Cassius could respond, and the twins ran in, Mira following with an apologetic expression. The children had sensed their father's anger somehow, had felt it through the palace like a disturbance in the air, and they wrapped their arms around Isla in silent defense. Their signs were clear and adamant. She's ours. We choose her. Please. Cassius looked at his children protecting the woman who carried the name of his wife's killers, looked at Isla who stood straight and unafraid despite everything, and made a decision that would bind them all together in ways none of them fully understood yet. You may stay, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But Mira will place a truth binding on you. If you ever intend harm to my family, I will know instantly. The ritual was swift and surprisingly intimate, Mira's magic weaving between them as she spoke words in a language older than the covenant. A silver thread appeared in the air, visible only to those with magical sight, stretching from Isla's heart to Cassius's, pulsing with shared life. Isla gasped as the binding settled into place, and then gasped again as she felt the unexpected effect. The binding went both ways, and suddenly she could sense Cassius's emotions, the vast ocean of grief and loneliness he carried, the desperate love for his children, the fear of losing anyone else, the exhaustion of holding himself together for centuries. She agreed to the binding with a whisper, and Cassius felt her acceptance through the thread, felt her fierce protectiveness toward the twins and her terror of failing them. In the shadows of the corridor outside, Osric Vane watched through a crack in the door, his face tight with frustration as his carefully constructed accusation crumbled. He retreated silently, returned to his chambers, and sent a coded message via raven to an unknown recipient, the bird disappearing into the night sky carrying news of failure and a request for new instructions, and in the study, the newly bound family stood together, unaware of the larger game being played around them. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm of learning and slowly rebuilding trust, and then the annual Covenant Ball arrived like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and potentially devastating. All 7 territory lords would gather at Thornvale Palace for 3 days of political theater disguised as celebration, displays of power wrapped in silk and jewels, the kind of event where kingdoms could be made or broken over a glass of blood wine and a carefully placed insult. Cassius had been dreading it for months, not because he feared the political maneuvering, but because this year the whispers would be louder, the questions more pointed, the challenge to his fitness to rule more explicit. He was a widowed king without clear heirs, his children considered unsuitable for succession due to their deafness, and there were ambitious lords who saw weakness in his isolation and opportunity in his grief. The ball was meant to demonstrate stability and strength, but Cassius felt neither, and the approach of the event filled him with a dread he could taste like copper on his tongue. The twins burst into his study 3 days before the ball, their hands flying in rapid sign, their faces bright with an excitement that made his chest ache. They wanted to attend, had been practicing with Isla, knew the formal dances and the proper protocols, and they begged with such unguarded hope that Cassius felt something crack inside him. He had always refused their requests to participate in court events, had protected them from the stares and the whispers and the cruel calculations of vampire nobility who saw their deafness as a flaw that disqualified them from power. But now they stood before him signing that they were ready, that they wanted to be seen, that hiding felt worse than risking judgment. And Isla stood behind them with an expression that suggested she had put them up to this and would not back down easily. Cassius tried to explain gently why it was a bad idea, how other vampires would mock them, how they would be hurt by the cruelty of nobles who measured worth in narrow terms, how he could not bear to watch them suffer that kind of pain. The twins listened, and then Alara signed with devastating simplicity. "We hurt more when you hide us." Isla stepped forward then, her voice quiet but firm, and said what Cassius already knew but had been avoiding. "You're teaching them to hide." Elena wouldn't have wanted that. The invocation of his dead wife's name was calculated and effective, and Cassius felt his resistance crumble. Elena had been fearless, had believed that love meant standing visible and vulnerable, had taught him that hiding to avoid pain meant missing out on everything that made existence worth enduring. He made his decision and immediately regretted it and made it anyway. The twins could attend the opening ceremony only. They would wear formal court attire appropriate to their status, and Isla would accompany them as their companion and translator. After the initial presentation, they would retire before the serious political drinking and deal-making began. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, which Cassius took as a sign it was probably correct. The preparation consumed the next 3 days. Isla worked with the twins for hours each afternoon, teaching them formal court dances adapted to incorporate sign language, transforming the rigid traditional movements into something fluid and communicative. They learned to tell stories with their bodies while executing perfect waltz steps, to sign greetings and responses while maintaining the precise footwork that court protocol demanded. Cassius watched from the balcony overlooking the practice room, hidden in shadows where they could not see him, and felt something painful and beautiful lodge in his throat. His children were graceful and brilliant, moving with a synchronization that spoke of deep trust, and Isla guided them with patience and genuine affection. They looked like a family, the three of them, and Cassius felt his exclusion from that circle like a physical wound, even as he recognized it was largely self-inflicted. The night of the ball arrived with all the weight of ceremony and expectation. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a display of wealth and power that bordered on obscene, crystal chandeliers holding 1,000 candles each, silk draperies in the colors of all 7 territories, tables laden with delicacies both mortal and vampiric, servants in livery moving like choreographed dancers through the crowds. Blood wine flowed freely, the specially prepared vintage that could intoxicate even immortal metabolisms, and vampire nobility filled the space with their glittering gowns and sharp eyes and calculations dressed up as conversation. The territory lords arrived in order of precedence, each making an entrance designed to remind everyone of their power and importance, each bringing entourages of advisors and guards and family members who might be leveraged for alliance or advantage. They greeted Cassius with varying degrees of warmth and formality, and he read the political weather in their expressions. Concern about his leadership, questions about succession, speculation about whether the covenant might be better served by a different king. Lord Draven from the Southern Territory was particularly pointed in his observations about the importance of stable succession and the challenges of ruling while managing personal grief. The whispers started before the twins even entered, rippling through the ballroom like poison in water. The mad king who can't even teach his own children, those poor broken creatures he keeps locked away. What kind of ruler can't manage his own household? Perhaps it's time for new leadership. Cassius heard every word with his enhanced vampire hearing and felt rage building in his chest. Hot and dangerous, but he kept his expression neutral and his hands steady on the glass of blood wine a servant had pressed into his palm. Then the grand doors opened, and the twins entered with Isla between them, and the entire ballroom went silent. Alara wore a gown of silver silk that caught the candlelight like moonlight on water, her dark hair woven with pearls, her face solemn and lovely. Rowan wore a black suit cut in the formal style of vampire nobility, his bearing straight and proud, despite the tremor in his hands that only someone looking closely would notice. And Isla wore midnight blue, a gown that Cassius had commissioned as a gift, though he had not admitted why, and she moved with quiet confidence that suggested she belonged exactly where she was. The room watched them cross the floor toward the dais, where Cassius stood. And the quality of the silence shifted from shock to something uglier, pity mixed with contempt, the particular cruelty of people who had decided these children were lesser and were now searching for evidence to confirm their prejudice. The twins' hands began to tremble more noticeably, their steps faltering slightly, and Cassius felt his control slip. He moved to intervene, to end this ceremony early and spare his children the pain of being spectacle and judgment, but Isla caught his eye and shook her head slightly, a small gesture that stopped him in his tracks. She signed something to the twins that he could not quite see, and they straightened, glanced at each other, and began to move. What happened next would be discussed in vampire courts for decades afterward. The twins began their sign dance, movements flowing between formal court steps and their own invented language, and Isla translated their greeting into spoken words that rang clear through the silent ballroom. They told the story of Thornvale's founding, how Cassius had united 7 warring territories through a combination of strategic brilliance and unwavering principle, how he had created the covenant that had brought 2 centuries of relative peace to lands that had known only blood and chaos before. Every detail was historically accurate, every date and name precise, and the twins told it not as rote recitation, but as living narrative, their bodies making the story visible, their signs giving it texture and depth. The audience reaction shifted visibly from shock to fascination. The dance was mesmerizing, beautiful in a way that transcended the expected categories of court performance, and the story was perfectly executed with nuances that demonstrated deep understanding rather than mere memorization. Cassius had taught them the history himself during their lessons, had shared stories of the early days of his rule, and they had absorbed everything and transformed it into something new. The political shift in the room was almost tangible. The lords were recalculating, reassessing, realizing that these children were not disabled in any meaningful sense, but rather differently abled. Brilliant minds in bodies that communicated through movement rather than sound, and that meant they could potentially serve as heirs after all. Power dynamics rearranged themselves, as vampire nobility always rearranged when new information altered the landscape of possibility. When the twins finished their performance, the applause was genuine and prolonged, and Cassius felt something very close to pride. Lord Draven approached immediately afterward, moving with the predatory grace of an ambitious vampire who had just seen an opportunity. He bowed to Cassius and then turned to Alara, asking with perfect formality if she would honor him with a dance. It was a political move disguised as courtesy, a way to get close to the potential heir and assess her capabilities, and Cassius felt protective fury rise hot and immediate. He stepped between Draven and his daughter, his voice cold and absolute. "My daughter is not on display." Draven smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Then perhaps you shouldn't parade her like a curiosity, Your Majesty." The insult was carefully calibrated to be deniable if challenged, but clear enough to sting, and Cassius felt his control wavering dangerously. Isla intervened before the confrontation could escalate, stepping forward and accepting the dance on Alara's behalf as the child's companion and representative. It was an acceptable substitution according to court protocol, and Draven could not refuse without being openly rude. He led Isla onto the dance floor while Alara watched from the sidelines, and Cassius watched them both, tracking every movement, every word exchanged. Isla performed the traditional waltz with competence, her posture correct, and her steps precise. And while her hands moved, she signed a running translation of the conversation to Alara, teaching the child how to navigate political small talk and hidden agendas, even while appearing to be merely dancing. It was brilliant and subtle, and Cassius felt something warm and dangerous stirring in his chest, something that felt like admiration mixed with other feelings he was not ready to examine. Then Isla's expression changed. She was facing the refreshment tables while dancing, and her eyes locked onto something that made her entire body go tense. Cassius followed her gaze and saw Osric speaking with servers near the bloodwine, saw his steward's hand move in a gesture too quick and too casual, saw something small and dark fall from his fingers into the glass that servants were preparing to bring to the king. The protective wards Isla had drawn weeks ago in flour on the kitchen floor had not been paranoia or superstition. There was a real plot, a blood curse attempt, just as Mira had warned, and Osric was executing it in front of hundreds of witnesses who were too distracted by politics and performance to notice. Isla's mind raced through impossible choices. She could interrupt now, cause a scene, accuse the king's most trusted steward of poisoning in front of all the territory lords, and if she was wrong, she would ruin the ball and destroy what little political capital Cassius had left. Or she could wait, could hope she was mistaken, and risk Cassius drinking poison that might kill him or worse. The truth-binding thrummed between them, and she felt his trust like a weight and a gift. She made her decision, excused herself from the dance with a graceful curtsy to Draven, and moved through the crowd with controlled urgency toward where Cassius stood. He was reaching for the glass a servant offered, the poisoned blood wine that would look like any other vintage, and Isla caught his wrist just as the rim touched his lips. Her hands shaped urgent signs. "Don't drink." Every vampire in the room turned to watch. The ballroom fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was dangerous, charged with speculation and judgment. Cassius stood frozen with the glass halfway to his mouth and Isla's hand on his wrist, and the truth-binding sang between them, carrying her terror and certainty. Osric moved immediately to control the narrative, his voice smooth and concerned. "Perhaps Miss Renwick is overwhelmed by her first formal ball. She's unused to such events. Maybe the companion needs rest." It was beautifully done, dismissing her warning as hysteria or incompetence, giving Cassius a graceful way to ignore her and proceed. But Cassius looked at Isla, really looked, and remembered everything. The protective wards she had drawn, the care she had shown his children, the truth-binding that meant she could not intend him harm without him knowing. He set the glass down with deliberate care and said clearly enough for the entire ballroom to hear, "Miss Renwick's counsel is always welcome." Mira appeared then, from where she had been watching the proceedings, with a seer's attention to dangerous possibilities. She took the glass from the table, produced a silver pin from her robes, and ran it through the blood wine while speaking a word of revelation. The liquid hissed and turned black, the silver pin corroding instantly, and the stench of dark magic filled the air. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility. "Poison designed specifically to weaken vampire cognitive function," Mira announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "It wouldn't kill, but would leave His Majesty vulnerable to magical compulsion for 72 hours. Long enough to sign away a kingdom, or name an unworthy successor, or make any number of decisions that could not be easily undone." The ballroom erupted into chaos, accusations flying in all directions, nobles demanding to know who would dare attack the Covenant King, guards moving to secure the exits. And Osric, seeing his plot crumbling, made his own move with the desperate calculation of someone who had already committed treason and had nothing left to lose. He pointed at Isla, his voice rising above the confusion. "She was near the refreshment table earlier. She has hunter blood. This is revenge for Queen Elena." It was a masterful deflection, using the one piece of information guaranteed to make Cassius doubt, weaponizing Isla's heritage against her. For one terrible moment, Cassius felt old suspicions rise, felt the weight of grief and paranoia warring with trust. But the truth-binding held steady, showing him Isla's innocence and terror, and he made his choice. "Isla saved me," Cassius said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of 8 centuries of rule. "Guards, detain Lord Vane for questioning." Osric ran. He moved with supernatural vampire speed, faster than any normal guard could track, and smashed through the ballroom's tall windows in an explosion of glass and wood. He vanished into the night, and by the time guards reached the broken window, he was gone completely, disappeared as though he had never existed. The territory lords converged on Cassius immediately, their voices overlapping in demands for explanation and action. Covenant law was invoked, the ancient protocols that governed vampire society, when the king's fitness to rule was questioned. If Cassius could not prove the stability of his succession and capture the traitor within 1 week, the council could vote to dissolve his kingship and select a new ruler. The ultimatum was clear: 7 days to find Osric, prove the full extent of the plot, and formally establish the twins as heirs by demonstrating they could rule. 7 days to save his kingdom and his family. The ballroom emptied quickly after that, political vultures circling but retreating to their territories to calculate angles and alliances, servants cleaning broken glass and whispering about what they had witnessed. The twins clutched Isla with desperate strength, their earlier triumph forgotten in the terror of watching their father nearly poisoned and their world destabilized. Cassius stood alone at the broken window, staring into darkness where his most trusted advisor had fled, and felt the weight of centuries pressing down. He turned to his children, saw their fear, saw Isla holding them with fierce protection, and signed with hands that barely trembled, "I will not lose you, any of you." The truth binding carried his determination and his fear in equal measure. And Isla felt the full weight of what they were facing, the impossible task ahead, and the certainty that failure meant losing everything they had built together. Outside in the darkness, Osric ran through forests toward the borderlands, toward allies and contingencies he had prepared for exactly this possibility, and behind him, the Thornvale Palace stood lit against the night sky like a fortress under siege, which in every way that mattered, it was. The palace locked down within minutes of Osric's escape, every gate sealed and every corridor patrolled by guards whose loyalty Cassius could only hope was genuine. Mira worked through the night performing tracking spells, her magic reaching out across the territories like invisible fingers searching for any trace of the steward's passage, but she found nothing except frustrating absence. Osric had vanished completely, protected by masking magic powerful enough to deflect even a court sorceress's seeking, which meant he had resources and allies Cassius had never suspected. The realization that his most trusted advisor had been planning treason under his nose, for who knew how long, made Cassius feel ancient and foolish. 800 years of experience, apparently worth nothing against well-placed deception. He summoned his remaining loyal guards to the war room, a chamber deep in the palace's fortified core where strategy had been planned for centuries, and was unsurprised when Mira arrived, but genuinely shocked when she brought Isla and the twins with her. The war room was all maps and weapons, a massive table dominating the center where territories were marked in colored pins and troop movements could be traced. And Cassius looked at his children standing there with sleep-tousled hair and frightened eyes and felt his heart crack. They should not have to be part of this, should not have to learn about betrayal and conspiracy at 12 years old, even if those 12 years had lasted a century and a half. But Mira signed to him that the twins had refused to sleep until they knew what was happening, and Isla had refused to leave them alone in their fear. So they all stood around the war table while dawn crept toward the windows, and Cassius laid out the extent of their problem with brutal honesty, because pretending would only make things worse. Osric had been his steward for 3 centuries, had access to every aspect of palace operations, every secret and every weakness, and they had to assume that all intelligence was compromised and all security protocols potentially betrayed. The network of spies and informants that Cassius had built over decades might be working for Osric now, and there was no way to know who could be trusted. The twins listened with growing horror, their hands moving in small anxious gestures, and Isla stood behind them with her hands on their shoulders in silent comfort. Mira began her report on what her divination had shown, her voice taking on the distant quality it always carried when she spoke of visions. She had seen flashes of Osric meeting with a hooded figure in a place that stank of old violence and older magic, an exchange of gold coins and small vials that probably contained the poison used at the ball, and the location appeared to be an old hunter's fort in the borderlands. The vision had been fragmented and unclear, obscured by the same masking magic that hid Osric's current location, but Mira was certain about the fort, and reasonably certain about the timing. Whatever Osric was planning, it would happen soon, probably within the 7-day deadline the council had imposed. The borderlands were neutral territory, a strip of wild land between the Covenant and the human kingdoms where neither vampire nor mortal law held sway. It had become a haven for exiles and criminals, for those running from justice or seeking to escape the constraints of civilization, and it was exactly the kind of place where a traitor could hide and plan. Cassius stared at the map, at the section marked Borderlands in faded ink, and tried to calculate logistics and probability. He would need a strike team, small and fast, capable of moving through hostile territory without drawing attention. But he did not know the borderlands well, had never had reason to travel through that lawless region, and sending forces in blind was asking for ambush and failure. Isla spoke then, her voice quiet but clear in the tense silence of the war room. She could guide them, she said. She knew the borderlands' paths from childhood. Her grandmother's cottage still stood there, and she had visited it only months ago to collect the recipe book. She knew which trails were safe and which were watched, knew where water could be found, and where old hunter traps still waited for the unwary, knew the borderlands the way only someone who had grown up there could know them. Cassius refused immediately and absolutely. It was too dangerous. She was a civilian, not a soldier. He would not risk her life on a military mission, no matter how valuable her knowledge might be. The twins erupted in furious signing, their hands moving so fast that even Isla struggled to follow. If Isla went, they went. They would not be separated from her. They would not stay behind like helpless children while the adults went into danger. The argument was circular and passionate, and Cassius felt control slipping as his children and this woman he had come to care for far too much all insisted on putting themselves in harm's way. Mira cut through the stalemate with a seer's practical assessment of probabilities. Cassius could not take the twins into the borderlands. That much was non-negotiable. The risk was too great, and they were too vulnerable. But he also could not leave them in the palace where traitor networks might still be operating, and Osric's allies could strike at them. The solution was to take them to a protected sanctuary, an ancient vampire stronghold in the mountains that Mira maintained for exactly such emergencies, warded against intrusion and stocked with supplies to last months if necessary. The twins would be safe there with Mira to guard them, and Cassius could pursue Osric with Isla as guide, and a small team of his most trusted guards. It was the best compromise available, and after long minutes of tense silence, Cassius accepted it. The goodbye was tearful and wrenching. Alara removed the silver ribbon from her hair and tied it around Isla's wrist, signing that it was for luck and Isla had to come back to return it. Rowan made Cassius promise on Elena's memory to return safely, to not do anything stupid or heroic, to remember that he was a father before he was a king. Cassius promised, feeling the weight of the oath settle into his bones, and watched Mira lead his children away through a portal of shimmering magic that would take them to the mountain sanctuary. Then there was nothing left but preparation and departure. The journey to the borderlands took most of a night. Cassius and Isla and 3 elite guards moving at vampire speed through forests and across rivers, covering ground that would take mortals days in a matter of hours. They reached the edge of the borderlands just as dawn broke, and the landscape transformed from cultivated Covenant territory to something wilder and more dangerous. Mist clung to the ground like living thing, forests grew thick and tangled with undergrowth that suggested decades without human management, and abandoned villages dotted the trails like monuments to failure and flight. There was a sense of forgotten magic lingering in the air, old and neither entirely benevolent nor actively malicious, just present and watching. Neither vampire nor human law applied here, and the absence of structure was almost palpable. Isla led them along paths that looked like nothing more than game trails, narrating stories as they walked to fill the tense silence. She told them about growing up here, about her grandmother's warnings about the darkness that lived in these woods, about the old hunter paths that crisscrossed the region, carrying traffic that preferred to avoid official scrutiny. She pointed out landmarks that meant safety or danger, explained which berries were edible and which streams carried parasites, demonstrated the kind of detailed practical knowledge that only came from lived experience. The guards listened with professional attention, recalculating their threat assessments based on her information. And Cassius listened too, but mostly he watched Isla move through this landscape like she belonged to it, graceful and confident, in a way she never quite was in the palace. They rested at noon in a small clearing, the guards taking positions around the perimeter, while Isla collapsed against a fallen log with visible exhaustion. Vampires needed minimal sleep, but she was still mortal, still bound by human limitations of stamina and endurance, and the night's travel had pushed her to her limits. Cassius built a small fire more for comfort than necessity, and they sat in companionable silence for a while before he asked the question that had been gnawing at him since the library revelation weeks ago. Why had her grandmother never sought forgiveness from him directly, never tried to make amends or explain or seek any kind of reconciliation? Isla answered quietly, staring into the flames. Her grandmother had thought Cassius would kill her on sight, had believed that carrying the surname of the man who led the hunters who murdered Elena was an unforgivable sin, had chosen exile and silence as the only penance available. She had carried that shame until death, had never spoken of her brother except to curse his name, had dedicated her life to preserving Elena's memory through recipes because it was the only redemption she could imagine. Cassius listened and felt old rage stir, the kind of anger that had driven him for decades after Elena's death. He confessed with brutal honesty that he would have killed Marta Renwick if she had approached him, would have killed her without hesitation or mercy, had in fact killed any Renwick he could find in the years after Elena's murder, until he realized that vengeance was transforming him into something his wife would have hated. Elena had believed in forgiveness and growth, had thought that people could change, and that love was stronger than hate, and he had dishonored her memory by becoming a creature of pure retribution. It had taken him decades to stop, to let the killing rage burn itself out, and by then the damage was done and he had become someone he barely recognized. They sat in shared grief and understanding, and Isla asked about Elena with genuine curiosity, wanting to know the woman beyond the recipes and the portrait. Cassius found himself describing things he had not spoken of in 2 centuries. Elena's laugh that was too loud for court propriety, her love of growing things and getting dirt under her fingernails, her fearlessness in the face of vampire politics and ancient prejudices. She had been human and mortal and impossibly brave, had chosen to marry him, knowing it meant entering a world that would never fully accept her, and she had done it anyway, because she believed love was worth the risk. His voice cracked on the last words, centuries of suppressed emotion forcing its way through his careful control. Isla asked softly whether he seemed like the man Elena had loved, and Cassius felt the question like a blade between his ribs. He did not know how to answer, did not know if that man still existed after 200 years of grief and isolation. Isla's honesty was gentle but uncompromising. He seemed like a man who had forgotten how to live when Elena died, she said. But the twins were waking him up, and he needed to let them, needed to choose life over prolonged mourning, needed to remember that Elena had loved him as a living, breathing person, capable of joy and not as a monument to grief. Her hand rested on the ground between them, and Cassius covered it with his own, feeling the truth-binding pulse and sing between them, carrying loneliness and longing from both sides. For a moment they sat like that, connected and vulnerable. And then arrows came screaming out of the darkness. The guards fell first, struck before they could even shout warning, and vampire assassins emerged from the mist with weapons designed specifically to kill their own kind. Cassius moved with the speed and skill of 8 centuries of combat experience, his body remembering battles fought when the world was young. But the assassins were good, and they used blood magic to counter his advantages. Spells designed to slow vampire reflexes, wards that disrupted supernatural strength, techniques that leveled the playing field between ancient king and hired killers. Isla acted on pure instinct, dropping to her knees and drawing ward symbols in the dirt with her fingers, creating a protective circle around herself and the one guard who had been wounded but not killed. Her magic flared bright and strong, far more powerful than a kitchen maid should possess. And Cassius realized even while fighting for his life that she had been hiding the full extent of her abilities. The training this required, the control and knowledge, spoke of years of study and practice that did not fit with her story of being a simple hedge witch's granddaughter. But there was no time to question, no space for anything except survival. Cassius killed with brutal efficiency, his hands and teeth and the ancient sword he carried all becoming weapons. And when the last assassin fell, he was covered in blood and breathing hard with exertion. One assassin lived long enough to interrogate, and Cassius extracted information with methods he was not proud of but would not hesitate to use. Osric had hired them, was paying premium rates for vampire killers with blood magic training, and he was indeed at the old Renwick Hunter fort. Whatever he was planning would happen tomorrow night, the night of the new moon when the barriers between worlds grew thin and dark, magic became easier to channel. The fort was 2 hours away on foot, heavily guarded, and now Cassius's team was reduced to himself, Isla, and one guard too injured to fight effectively. The tactical situation was a disaster, but sending for reinforcements would take 12 hours minimum, and they did not have that kind of time. Isla offered the alternative, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. She remembered her grandmother's stories about the fort, remembered that it had a secret entrance through an old well system that the hunters had used for smuggling and escape. She could get them inside quietly, give them the element of surprise, let them infiltrate and discover the full extent of Osric's conspiracy before striking. It was a terrible plan, the kind of desperate gamble that got people killed, and Cassius found himself agreeing because they had no better options. They approached the fort at twilight, the old stone structure looming against the darkening sky like a monument to violence and hatred. The Renwick Hunter clan had built it generations ago as a base for their war against vampires, and it still carried the psychic residue of that purpose, a feeling of concentrated malice that made the air taste like copper. Isla led them to the overgrown well, its stone rim cracked and covered in moss, and before they descended, Cassius made her promise to run if things went wrong, to prioritize survival over heroism. She agreed, her voice solemn and her eyes sincere, but her fingers crossed behind her back in the classic gesture of a promise not meant to be kept. Cassius saw the reflection in the well water, saw her small act of defiance, and chose not to comment because he understood it. She would no more abandon him than he would abandon his children, and there was something both terrifying and comforting in that knowledge. They descended into darkness, and above them the last light faded from the sky. The well tunnel led deep into the earth, ancient stones slick with moisture and the smell of decay, and eventually it opened into the fort's lower levels where the air was thick with the stench of blood and dark magic. They found evidence of Osric's true plot scattered through the abandoned rooms like pieces of a horrible puzzle, correspondence with remnants of the Renwick Hunter clan, promises of territory concessions in exchange for assistance, letters from Lord Draven outlining plans for assuming the Covenant throne after Cassius was removed. The conspiracy was larger and more complex than Cassius had imagined, a web of alliance between vampire factions who resented his rule and human hunters who wanted to destabilize vampire power entirely. At the center of it all was Osric, and the evidence revealed something Cassius had never suspected. His steward was half-human, a secret he had hidden for centuries. Born of a union between vampire and mortal at a time when such mixing was forbidden. He had served Cassius faithfully for 300 years while secretly resenting pure-blood vampire rule, nursing grievances and building networks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They found him in what had once been the fort's main ritual chamber, a vast space carved from living rock and covered in symbols that predated the covenant by centuries. Candles burned in complex patterns around blood circles drawn with precision and care, and in the center of it all, Osric stood preparing a spell that made Mira's warnings about blood curses seem almost quaint. He was attempting to summon and bind the Hollow King, a mythical entity from vampire legend, the supposed progenitor of all vampire bloodlines who had been sealed away in the earliest days of history. If the legends were true, the Hollow King could control every vampire in existence, could compel obedience from even the most ancient and powerful, and freeing him would mean the end of vampire civilization as it currently existed. Osric saw them enter and smiled, the expression carrying no warmth or humor, only satisfaction at a plan proceeding as expected. "Right on time," he said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "I needed royal blood for the final binding." The chamber sealed, magical barriers slamming into place with a sound like breaking stone, and Cassius and Isla found themselves separated from their injured guard, and alone with a traitor and a ritual that could destroy everything. Osric began the spell, words in a language older than kingdoms spilling from his mouth, and Cassius attacked with all the speed and fury of an ancient vampire king defending his realm. They fought across the ritual chamber, Osric proving himself far more formidable than expected. Preparation and ritual enhancement made him nearly Cassius's equal despite the centuries of age difference, and every blow Cassius landed was matched and countered. Isla worked frantically to disrupt the blood circle symbols, her ward magic flaring as she tried to break the ritual's foundation, but Osric had anticipated her interference and woven protections into his spell work. She managed to crack some of the outer circles, felt the ritual structure weaken, but it was not enough, and Osric was still chanting and the air was growing thick with approaching presence. Then Osric showed her something that made her blood freeze, a portrait pulled from his robes and thrust toward her face. "This is your uncle," he said, breathing hard from combat but still smiling. "Marcus Renwick, who led the hunters that killed Queen Elena, your grandmother's precious brother. You were sent by the surviving clan members to finish what they started, to infiltrate the palace and destroy the king from within." Isla's denial was immediate and passionate, swearing it was a lie, that she had never known her uncle, that her grandmother had fled the clan before Ela was born and never returned. But the portrait looked disturbingly like her, same dark hair and sharp features, and the doubt it created was visible on Cassius's face. For one terrible moment he hesitated, looked at Isla with suspicion creeping back into his eyes, despite the truth binding, and the connection between them wavered as his ancient paranoia warred with his growing trust. Osric exploited that moment of hesitation with vicious precision, his blade striking faster than thought, aimed directly at Cassius's heart. The wound would have been fatal, would have killed even a vampire king if the blade had found its target, but Isla moved without thinking and threw herself between them. She took the strike meant for Cassius, felt the blade punch through her ribs and lung, felt her blood spray across the ritual chamber floor in hot arterial pulses. Her blood hit the broken ritual circle and something fundamental shifted. Her willing sacrifice disrupting the Hollow King summoning in ways that simple ward magic never could. The spell fractured, the summoning collapsing in on itself, and Osric screamed in fury. Seeing Isla dying broke something in Cassius that had been held together by will and necessity for 200 years. He accessed power he had suppressed for centuries. The true aspect of the Vampire King that was more than just age and skill, but something primal and terrible. He moved like lightning and shadow, faster than Osric could track, and the fight that followed was not combat, but execution. Osric died in seconds, his pleas for mercy falling on ears that had stopped listening to anything except rage and grief. And when it was over, Cassius stood in a chamber painted with blood and cradled Ela's dying body in his arms. She was bleeding out, the wound catastrophic and mortal, minutes of life left at most. Cassius could turn her, could make her vampire and save her life, But covenant law required explicit consent for transformation, and she was too weak to speak, her breath coming in wet gasps that spoke of collapsing lungs. He held her and felt helpless and ancient, 800 years of existence useless in the face of one mortal woman's mortality. Then Isla's hand moved, trembling and weak but deliberate, shaping signs he recognized. Trust you. Choose life. It was consent, barely, exactly enough to satisfy both law and conscience, and Cassius did not let himself hesitate. He bit his own wrist, vampire blood welling dark and potent, and pressed it to her mouth in the ancient ritual of blood sharing that would transfer his immortal essence into her dying body. The transformation was agonizing, her body convulsing as mortal biology fought against the changes being forced upon it. But Cassius held her through it and whispered Elena's name like a prayer or a plea for forgiveness. He did not know if he was asking his dead wife for permission to love again, or simply invoking her memory as a protection against the darkness. But the name fell from his lips like ritual, and Isla's convulsions gradually slowed. Reinforcements finally broke through the magical barriers, guards and Mira arriving too late to help with the fight, but in time to witness the aftermath. They found Osric dead, the ritual chamber destroyed, and Cassius holding an unconscious Isla, whose heartbeat was already slowing toward the suspended animation that marked vampire transformation. 3 days remained until the new moon deadline. 3 days for Cassius to return to the palace and prove to the council that his rule was stable and his succession secured. He carried Isla's comatose body back through the borderlands and into Covenant territory, and he did not know if she would wake or what she would become when the transformation completed, but he knew with absolute certainty that he had just bound his fate to hers in ways that went far beyond politics or duty, and the knowledge terrified and sustained him in equal measure. The palace infirmary smelled of herbs and old magic. Potions that Mira had brewed to ease the transformation process lined up on shelves, like soldiers awaiting orders. And Isla lay unconscious in the center bed while Cassius sat beside her, refusing to move. 2 days had passed since they returned from the borderlands. 2 days of watching her body fight against the changes being forced upon it. 2 days of uncertainty about whether she would wake or what she would become if she did. Cassius had not slept, had barely eaten, had simply sat vigil beside the woman who had thrown herself between him and death, with the kind of selfless courage he had not seen since Elena walked among the living. The twins visited constantly, slipping past guards and protocols to curl up on chairs near Isla's bed, their small hands reaching out to touch her arm or hold her hand, their faces tight with worry that made them look far older than their frozen 12 years. Mira performed examinations every few hours, her magic probing the transformation's progress, and each time she withdrew with a troubled expression that made Cassius's ancient heart clench with dread. The transformation was progressing, she explained, but it was unusual in ways she had never witnessed before. Isla's inherent magic was fighting her new vampire nature, the hedge witch power her grandmother had taught her warring against the immortal essence Cassius had given her, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. She might wake as a vampire with her magic intact, a combination so rare as to be nearly mythical, or she might wake as a vampire who had burned out her magic entirely in the transformation struggle, or she might not wake at all if the two forces destroyed each other completely. All they could do was wait and hope, and Cassius discovered that 8 centuries of existence had not prepared him for the particular torture of helpless waiting. Political pressure mounted with each passing hour. The territory lords sent increasingly urgent messages demanding Cassius's appearance before the council, reminding him that the deadline was tomorrow, and he had yet to formally establish succession or provide a full accounting of Osric's treason. Some messages were sympathetic, acknowledging the difficulty of his situation, but others carried barely veiled threats about what would happen if he failed to appear. The Covenant had laws and procedures for exactly this scenario. mechanisms for removing a king who could not fulfill his duties, and there were lords who would be perfectly happy to invoke those mechanisms and claim the throne for themselves. Cassius read the messages and felt torn between impossible choices. Staying with Isla felt like abandoning his kingdom and failing the duties he had sworn to uphold for centuries. But attending to political theater while she lay dying felt like abandoning someone who had sacrificed everything for him and his children. Both options carried the weight of betrayal, and he sat frozen between them, unable to choose. The twins made the choice for him. They appeared at his side in the quiet hour before dawn on the day of the council meeting, both children dressed in their nightclothes but wide awake and serious. Their hands moved in careful, deliberate signs, and even exhausted and grief-stricken Cassius could understand their message. Isla would want him to protect the kingdom she bled for. She would be angry if he lost his crown because he was being stubborn about sitting vigil. They would stay with her while he attended the council, and if she woke they would send for him immediately. And he needed to trust them because they were not children anymore, and they understood what duty meant. Cassius looked at his children and saw the truth of what they were saying, saw that they had grown beyond his ability to shelter them, saw that Isla had taught them about responsibility and sacrifice in ways he never could. He agreed with a heart that felt like it was being torn in half, and went to prepare himself for political battle. The preparation felt like putting on armor for war. Cassius bathed away the blood and dirt of the borderlands, dressed in formal regalia that marked him as vampire king of the Covenant, arranged his hair and his expression into the masks of power and control that he had worn for so many centuries. They felt like a second skin. He looked like a king again when he studied his reflection, ancient and terrible and absolutely in command. But his hands shook when he thought about Ela lying unconscious while he played politics. He was halfway to the door, steeling himself for what was to come, when he heard the gasp. Isla woke with a scream that died in her throat, her eyes flying open to reveal irises that had transformed from brown to gold red, the distinctive color of new vampires, whose immortal nature had not yet fully settled. She bolted upright in bed, and immediately wished she hadn't, as her new senses crashed over her like a tidal wave. She could hear heartbeats from floors away, the rhythmic thump of mortal servants going about their morning duties, could distinguish individual pulses and identify which belonged to humans and which to vampires by subtle differences in tempo. She could see dust motes floating in the air like galaxies, could track their paths with perfect clarity, could read the texture of the stone walls as though running her fingers over them. She could smell individual ingredients in the kitchen 300 feet distant, could separate cinnamon from cardamom from vanilla with perfect precision. And beneath it all was the overwhelming scent of blood, rich and copper and calling to something hungry and terrible that had awakened inside her. The sensory overload was crushing, too much information flooding through channels not designed to handle it, and she curled in on herself, gasping for air she no longer technically needed. Cassius was there instantly, his hands taking hers, his voice cutting through the chaos with steady authority. He taught her to filter sensations, to imagine closing doors on the inputs she didn't need, to focus on one thing at a time until her new senses learned to regulate themselves. His voice became an anchor in the storm, something familiar and safe to cling to while her entire existence rearranged itself, and gradually the overwhelming flood reduced to something manageable. But then the bloodlust hit, her new vampire nature screaming for sustenance, for the blood that would complete her transformation and settle her immortal essence into permanent form. The hunger was all-consuming, worse than anything she had ever experienced, a need that went beyond physical into something primal and desperate. Cassius offered his wrist without hesitation, biting it open so his ancient blood welled dark and potent, explaining that new vampires could safely feed from their sire without risk of blood bonding or other complications. Isla hesitated for only a moment before instinct took over, and she drank. The feeding was intensely personal, far more intimate than she had expected. Through Cassius's blood she tasted his memories, saw flashes of his 800 years of existence, felt the crushing loneliness of centuries spent ruling alone, witnessed his love for Elena like a star burning at the center of his being, and underneath it all sensed his growing care for Isla herself, a feeling he had not yet named but that sang through his blood like music. She saw herself through his eyes, saw how much she had come to matter, saw the terror he had felt when she was dying, and the desperate relief when she signed her consent to transformation. When she pulled away, both of them breathing hard despite Vampire's limited need for air, she felt horrified and awed in equal measure. "I felt everything," she whispered, staring at him with wide gold-red eyes. "Your whole life." Cassius's vulnerability was raw and unguarded in that moment. "Then you know I couldn't let you die." Isla's anger flared, fear speaking louder than reason. "You should have asked. I didn't want this." But even as the words left her mouth, the truth binding flared between them, the silver thread that connected their hearts pulsing with light and revealing the lie. The binding showed her actual feelings, relief at being alive, gratitude for his choice, terror at her new existence, and underneath it all, something else she could not quite name, something that felt dangerous and precious, and absolutely terrifying. She gasped as the truth hit her, as she felt her own emotions reflected back with perfect clarity, and Cassius saw it all too through their connection. His apology was quiet but sincere. "I'm sorry, I was selfish, but I'm not sorry you're alive." Before Isla could respond, the twins burst into the room, their careful vigil abandoned in favor of celebration, their hands flying in sign language so fast it blurred even to her new vampire vision. They hugged her carefully, aware that she was still adjusting to her new strength and might accidentally hurt them if startled, and their joy was so pure and unguarded that Isla felt tears threatening even though she wasn't entirely sure vampires could cry. Alara signed with solemn certainty, "You're like father now, family forever." The words settled into Isla's chest like a vow, and she understood with sudden clarity that her transformation had bound her to this family in ways that went far beyond employment or duty. Mira entered then, her expression troubled despite the happiness of the reunion, and reminded them all that the council meeting was in 3 hours, and they still had to present a united front capable of convincing 7 territory lords that Cassius's rule remained stable. Ila's transformation would be seen as a political move by some, an improper rushing of intimacy by others, and they needed to control the narrative before rumors did damage they could not repair. The plan came together quickly. Cassius would present the twins as official heirs, would demonstrate their competence through public testing, would announce Osric's treason and death with full evidence, and would acknowledge Isla's sacrifice and subsequent transformation as acts of loyalty and courage. Isla would stand with the twins as their companion and guardian, and her new vampire status would actually strengthen her position since she could now protect them eternally rather than for a single mortal lifetime. It was political theater of the highest order, and they all knew it, but sometimes theater was what held kingdoms together. The council chamber was packed when they entered, all 7 territory lords seated at the long table with their advisors arrayed behind them, galleries filled with vampire nobility who had come to witness either Cassius's triumph or his fall. The air was thick with anticipation and calculation, political sharks circling in waters made bloody by crisis and opportunity. Cassius entered with the twins flanking him and Isla 1 step behind, a power statement that made his intentions clear before any words were spoken. He presented evidence of Osric's treason with methodical precision, describing the conspiracy with hunters and rival vampire factions, explaining the attempted summoning of the Hollow King and the ritual that had been interrupted. He named Lord Draven as co-conspirator and watched the Southern Territory Lord's face cycle through shock and fury and calculation before settling on false innocence. Draven's defense was smooth and well-prepared, claiming complete ignorance of Osric's actions, insisting the steward had acted alone, pointing out that there was no concrete proof of his involvement beyond correspondence that could have been forged. It was a reasonable defense that might have worked if Mira had not been waiting for exactly this moment. She stepped forward and performed a truth spell, ancient magic that would compel honesty from anyone who submitted to it willingly. Draven refused, and his refusal itself was damning, resistance proving guilt as clearly as any confession. Guards seized him as he snarled threats about how this was tyranny and overreach, and he was dragged from the chamber still protesting while the other lords watched with expressions ranging from satisfaction to concern about the precedent being set. Then came the challenge Cassius had been expecting. A skeptical lord from the Eastern Territory rose and asked with elaborate courtesy how deaf children could possibly rule the Covenant, demanded a demonstration of competence rather than vague assurances, pointed out that leadership required communication and quick decision-making that seemed impossible for those who could neither hear nor speak. It was the prejudice Cassius had been fighting for a century and a half, and now was the moment to shatter it permanently. The test was brutal in its complexity. A trade dispute between territories involving overlapping resource claims, historical grievances, economic interdependencies, and legal ambiguities that would challenge even experienced diplomats. The scenario was presented to the twins, and the council waited to see them fail. Elara and Rowan conferred in sign language, their hands moving in rapid conversation that Isla watched, but did not interrupt. And then they presented their solution. It was brilliant, finding a compromise that acknowledged historical claims while creating new economic frameworks, that satisfied pride while generating practical benefit, that turned a zero-sum conflict into a situation where all parties could gain something valuable. They had not just answered the question, but had demonstrated diplomatic thinking that outpaced adults with centuries of experience, and the council chamber fell silent in genuine shock. The formal declaration came next, Cassius's voice ringing with authority as he named Elara and Rowan as co-heirs to the Covenant throne and designated Isla as their guardian and regent protector until they reached their majority age of 18. The vote was required by law, and tension filled the chamber as the territory lords deliberated and calculated political advantage. The final tally was 4 territories in favor, 2 opposed, 1 abstention, and the motion carried by the required majority. Isla knelt before the council then and swore the guardian's oath, an ancient ritual that bound her immortal life to the twins' protection, that made their safety more important than her own survival, that transformed her from companion into something closer to sacred trust. Cassius watched her take the oath and felt something shift in his chest, felt the last barriers around his heart crack and crumble as he realized what he felt was no longer gratitude or respect, but something far more dangerous and far more precious. But this was not the time for such revelations, not in the political theater of the council chamber, so he locked the feeling away and focused on the business of kingship. The council adjourned with crisis averted and succession established, and the vampire nobility filtered out making their calculations about how this changed the landscape of power and influence. Cassius felt victory like ashes in his mouth, hollow and unsatisfying, until Elara tugged his hand and signed that they had done it. They were officially heirs now, and her joy made the political maneuvering feel worthwhile. But as they were leaving, Mira pulled Cassius aside, her expression grave. The Hollow King's summoning was interrupted, not destroyed, she said quietly. Something came through. Something is watching the palace. The victory celebration was small and private. Just the 5 of them gathered in the family dining room, far from the formal halls where politics happened. The twins were giddy with recognition, bouncing in their seats and signing so fast that even Isla's new vampire vision struggled to follow, because for the first time in 150 years, they had futures that extended beyond being hidden away and protected from a world that didn't understand them. Isla was still adjusting to her new vampire nature, everything tasting different now, flavors sharper and stranger, and she mourned small losses of humanity, even while recognizing the gifts she had gained. Sunlight would burn her now, would turn her skin to ash if she was careless, and she grieved the loss of dawn even as she marveled at her new ability to see in complete darkness. Cassius understood, had walked this path himself 800 years ago when he chose transformation to save a dying village from plague, had become immortal to protect mortals in an irony that had never quite faded. After the twins were put to bed, tired and happy and still signing excitedly to each other about their new status, Cassius and Isla walked the palace gardens together. The moon garden bloomed only at night, flowers that opened under starlight and filled the air with perfume designed for vampire senses, and they moved through it in comfortable silence until the weight of unspoken things became too heavy to bear. They talked about what happened now, about Isla's role and responsibilities, about whether she regretted the transformation, despite what the truth binding had revealed. Isla's honesty was careful and precise. I regret how it happened, but I don't regret being alive to see Alara and Rowan grow. Cassius's confession came before he could stop it, words spilling out with the weight of truth too long suppressed. When you signed trust you and choose life, I knew I'd do anything to keep you. That was selfish. Isla stopped walking and turned to face him. Why? I'm just a kitchen maid. Cassius looked at her standing in moonlight, this woman who had brought his children back to him, who had taught him that hope was not always a trap, who had thrown herself between him and death without hesitation, and spoke truth he had been avoiding for weeks. You brought my children back to me. You made me remember what it feels like to hope. You're not just anything. They leaned toward each other, the moment charged with possibility, and the truth-binding singing between them with feelings neither had quite named, but both recognized. And their lips were inches apart when Mira's sending spell crashed into their minds with urgent summons. Something's in the library. Come now. They found ancient books thrown open across the library's reading tables, specific pages marked with symbols that made Cassius's skin crawl, all of them referencing the Hollow King and the rituals required to summon or bind him. Mira stood in the center of the chaos, her face pale, and explained what her research had revealed. The ritual in the borderlands had been completed, just not the way Osric intended. Isla's blood sacrifice, her willing death to save Cassius, had created a different kind of binding, one that fragmented the Hollow King's essence and embedded pieces throughout the palace in objects that had witnessed strong emotion or held old magic. The entity had not possessed anyone, but had instead scattered itself, and those fragments were slowly reforming, drawing power from the palace's ambient magic and the emotions of those who lived there. 30 days remained until the next new moon, and if all the fragments were not found and destroyed before then, the Hollow King would manifest fully and consume every vampire bloodline in existence, ending their species and plunging the territories into chaos. The hunt began that night, all 5 of them committed to finding fragments that Mira estimated numbered between 7 and 13 based on the ritual's structure. Isla discovered she could sense the fragments, her blood having activated them, giving her a connection to their dark presence, and she became the key to their search. The twins insisted on helping, arguing that they could search palace areas adults ignored, that their small size was an advantage, that they were stronger than anyone gave them credit for. Cassius was reluctant, having just gotten them recognized as heirs, and now facing the prospect of endangering them again. But Isla's wisdom cut through his fear. We face this together, or the Hollow King wins. They're stronger than you think. They found the first fragment in the twins' old nursery, embedded in a music box that had played lullabies for 150 years. Mira destroyed it with cleansing fire, magic so hot it burned without consuming, and the fragment dissolved with a scream that only those with magical sensitivity could hear. One down, but the cost was immediate. Destroying the fragment released a pulse of dark magic that everyone in the palace felt, a wave of wrongness that set teeth on edge and made servants whisper nervously about curses and hauntings. Cassius provided the cover story, announcing that Mira was performing protective wards throughout the palace after Osric's betrayal, and most people accepted the explanation because it was plausible, and they wanted to believe their king had everything under control. That night, Isla dreamed, and the dreams were nothing like the peaceful darkness she had known as immortal. She saw the Hollow King's ancient face, features that were vampire but also something older and more terrible, eyes that held the memory of the world before kingdoms existed. His voice filled her mind like poison in water, intimate and horrifying. Little daughter of blood and magic, you cannot unmake what you have made. I am coming. And I will feast on everything you love. She woke screaming, her new vampire strength sending her bolt upright, with enough force to crack the bed frame, and Cassius was there instantly, despite his rooms being 2 corridors away. He held her while she shook, the truth binding pulsing between them with shared terror and shared determination. And neither of them spoke about how his arms felt like safety or how her presence felt like home, because naming such things would make them real and vulnerable, and they had enough vulnerability to manage already. Outside the palace walls, in shadows that predated the Covenant, fragments of an ancient evil pulsed with growing strength and waited for the moon to die. 28 days of hunting fragments had transformed them from separate individuals into something closer to a single unit, moving through the palace with coordinated purpose that came from shared danger and shared determination. 6 fragments had been found and destroyed, each one releasing pulses of dark magic that Cassius covered with increasingly creative explanations about protective wards and security enhancements, and Mira's divination confirmed what they had all hoped. 7 fragments total, which meant only 1 remained. But this final fragment was different, stronger than all the others combined, pulsing with concentrated malevolence that made Isla's new vampire senses scream warnings whenever she tried to locate it precisely. She could feel it calling to her blood, the connection forged when her sacrifice had fragmented the Hollow King's essence, and after days of searching, she finally pinpointed its location in the palace's oldest section, in rooms that had been sealed for so long that most current servants did not even know they existed. The old throne room had been abandoned for 400 years, locked and warded after Elena's death, because Cassius could not bear to enter the place where his wife had been murdered by Renwick hunters who had somehow penetrated palace defenses and turned celebration into massacre. He had not crossed that threshold in 2 centuries, had tried to forget the room existed at all, had built his current throne room in a completely different wing as though distance could erase memory. But now Isla stood outside the sealed doors and told him with absolute certainty that the fragment was inside, and Cassius felt 200 years of carefully maintained avoidance crumble into immediate crisis. He resisted with every argument he could muster, explaining that opening that room meant facing his worst memory, that he was not ready and might never be ready, that surely there had to be another way to destroy the fragment without him having to walk through Elena's blood again. The twins listened to his resistance and then presented their research, palace histories they had been studying with the kind of thorough attention to detail that made them such promising heirs. The old throne room had a secret that even Cassius apparently did not know. It had been built on an ancient vampire ritual site, ground that had been sacred to their kind for millennia before the Covenant existed, and beneath it lay what legend suggested was the Hollow King's original tomb. Mira confirmed the twins' research with grim certainty, explaining that Osric had not chosen his ritual location randomly, but had known the palace's deepest secret, had tried to awaken the Hollow King, where he had first been buried in an age when vampires were more myth than organized society. The implication was terrifying and unavoidable. The last fragment was in the tomb itself, embedded in the very place of greatest power and greatest danger, and destroying it would require entering chambers that predated the palace by unknown centuries. Tomorrow was the new moon, the final deadline, and they had to act tonight or lose everything. Preparation consumed the remaining daylight hours. Mira performing protection spells that made the air shimmer with defensive magic, Cassius retrieving his ancestral sword from the armory where it had hung unused for decades, Isla studying ward magic with an intensity that suggested she knew how much would depend on her ability to counter dark forces. The twins begged to accompany them, signing arguments about how they had helped with every other fragment, and this one should be no different. But Cassius refused with absolute finality, because the danger was too great, and he would not risk his children in the Hollow King's tomb. The compromise they reached was typical of their family's evolving dynamics. The twins would wait with Mira in an adjoining chamber, protected by the sorceress's most powerful wards, and if anything went wrong, they would run immediately without hesitation or heroics. The opening of the old throne room happened at midnight, Cassius's hands shaking as he removed wards and locks that had held for 200 years. And when the doors finally swung open, the smell of old grief rushed out like a living thing. Dust hung in the air thick enough to see, furniture covered in sheets like shrouded corpses, and in the center of the floor, a dark stain that Cassius recognized with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from trauma burned into memory. Elena's blood still marked the marble, 2 centuries not enough to erase the evidence of violence, and Cassius fell to his knees before it as 200 years of suppressed grief finally broke through his careful control and erupted in sobs that shook his entire body. Isla knelt beside him and held him while he broke apart, offering no empty comfort or false promises, but simply presence and understanding. She told him about her grandmother's death, about the long, slow grief of watching someone fade, about how she had learned that grief does not end but changes shape over time, transforms from sharp agony into something softer that can be carried alongside joy instead of consuming everything. Cassius listened through his tears and finally spoke the truth he had been avoiding for 2 centuries. I kept this room sealed, thinking I was preserving her memory. I was just preserving my pain. The tomb entrance was exactly where the twins' research had suggested, behind the throne itself, a stone staircase descending into darkness so complete it seemed to have weight and texture. Ancient carvings covered the walls, warnings in languages that predated modern vampire script, symbols that spoke of doom and damnation for any who disturbed what lay below. Cassius and Isla descended together, her magic providing light that pushed back shadows without fully dispelling them, his presence keeping darker things at bay through sheer force of ancient vampire authority. The chamber at the bottom was massive, carved from living rock with architectural precision that suggested this had once been a temple or sacred space, and in its center stood a sarcophagus covered in the same fragment symbols that had marked all the others, but pulsing with dark light that made the air itself feel poisonous. The Hollow King was not fully formed, but he was conscious, his presence filling the chamber like smoke, and when he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere, ancient and terrible, and utterly without mercy. He offered Cassius a deal with the casual certainty of something that had made such bargains for millennia, and knew exactly which desires to exploit. He could resurrect Elena, true resurrection, not vampire turning. She would be exactly as she had been before the hunters killed her, warm and mortal and alive. All Cassius had to do was surrender his bloodline and his kingdom, transfer his authority to the Hollow King, who would rule the Covenant with ancient power that brooked no challenge or resistance. It was everything Cassius had wanted for 200 years, offered on terms that would destroy everything Elena had valued, and the temptation was so overwhelming that for several long, terrible seconds, he actually considered it. Isla watched him hesitate, and felt horror crawl up her spine, realized he was genuinely weighing the offer against the cost, and the truth binding between them saying with his desperate longing and agonized uncertainty. Mira's voice came from above, shouting through the magical connection they maintained, urgent and terrified. The Hollow King was lying, she screamed. He needed Cassius's willing surrender to break free from his tomb, and resurrection was impossible because death was absolute and no magic could truly reverse it. But even knowing it was a lie, Cassius stood frozen by the sarcophagus, and Isla could feel through their bond how badly he wanted to believe, how much he ached for Elena's return, even if it meant his own destruction. Isla moved to stand before him, blocking his view of the tomb, forcing him to meet her eyes. Elena wouldn't want this, she said, her voice cutting through the Hollow King's seductive promises. She'd want you to live, to love your children, to let yourself be happy again. Cassius looked at Isla and saw truth in her gold-red eyes, saw the woman who had brought his children back to him and taught him that hope was not always a trap, saw a future that could include joy instead of just duty and grief. He looked past her at the tomb and saw only death and lies and the destruction of everything he had built over 8 centuries. The choice crystallized with sudden clarity, and he spoke words that echoed through the chamber with the weight of absolute decision. No, Elena is gone. But Ilara and Rowan are here. Isla is here. My kingdom is here. I choose the living. The Hollow King's fury was instantaneous and overwhelming, the sarcophagus exploding in a spray of stone fragments as dark entity emerged partially, not fully manifested, but powerful enough to kill everyone in the chamber if given the chance. Cassius fought with every skill he had accumulated over 8 centuries, his ancestral sword cutting through shadow and malice. But the Hollow King was ancient power that predated kingdoms and laws, and he was nearly overwhelming despite Cassius's experience and strength. Isla worked frantically on the ward she had been preparing since they entered the chamber, symbols drawn in her own blood that created a magical circle designed to channel the truth binding between them and amplify Cassius's strength through their connection. She completed the final sigil and felt power surge through the bond, felt Cassius's immortal essence magnified by her magic and her willingness to pour everything she had into protecting him. Together, they were stronger than either could be alone, Cassius striking with his sword, while Isla bound the entity with magic that drew on both vampire power and the hedge witch knowledge her grandmother had taught her. And for the first time since the battle began, they were winning. Then the twins entered the chamber, disobeying explicit orders because they had felt their father's desperation through some connection none of them had known existed, and they added their own small magic to the fight. Neither Cassius nor any doctor had realized the twins carried magic inherited from Elena's human bloodline, diluted but present, expressing itself in ways that were subtle until concentrated with desperate need. The 4 of them together created something entirely new, not just vampire power or hedge magic or human gift, but all 3 woven together through bonds of family and choice, love made manifest, and given teeth sharp enough to destroy ancient evil. The Hollow King's fragment shattered under the combined assault, the entity screaming as it dissolved into particles of darkness that faded like smoke in sunlight, and the tomb began to collapse around them as whatever magic had preserved it for millennia finally gave way. They ran up the stairs as the chamber crumbled, stone grinding against stone, with sounds like the world ending, and barely made it through the threshold before the staircase sealed itself behind them with finality that suggested it would never open again. The old throne room was destroyed, ceiling partially collapsed and walls cracked, but the curse was lifted, and the Hollow King was gone, and they were all alive. They sat in the rubble as exhaustion caught up with them, the twins curled between Cassius and Isla like they had when they were truly small, Mira smiling through tears of relief and residual terror, and dawn approached through the broken ceiling, which meant they needed to get inside before sunlight turned the new vampires to ash. But for just a few more minutes, they sat together in victorious silence and let themselves simply be a family that had survived impossible odds through stubborn love and refusal to surrender what mattered most. 6 months passed in a rhythm of healing and rebuilding and learning how to be a family instead of just survivors bound by crisis. The palace kitchen in early morning became their gathering place, Isla teaching the twins to make cinnamon bread using Elena's recipe, while Cassius sat at the scarred wooden table and watched with an expression that suggested he was storing up happiness against future darkness. The twins chattered in a mixture of sign and speech because they were learning spoken language now, not as requirement but as choice, expanding their communication options while still privileging the sign dance language that was uniquely theirs. Flour covered every surface and laughter filled the air, and Cassius had learned sign fluently enough to join their rapid conversations, to play with them instead of just providing for them, to father them in ways he had forgotten were possible. Isla had grown comfortable in her vampire skin, the new senses that had once overwhelmed her now integrated and controlled, and she served as the twins' guardian officially with respect from the council that would have seemed impossible when she was just a kitchen maid hired through normal channels. Rowan asked the question with the bluntness that only children possess, his hands shaping signs while his mouth formed words. When are Father and Isla getting married? Both adults froze, Cassius with a piece of bread halfway to his mouth, and Isla with her hands covered in flour, and the awkwardness was palpable despite the truth-binding's constant hum, carrying feelings they had not quite spoken aloud. Ilara observed with the kind of devastating honesty that made her such a promising heir. You look at each other like mother and father did in paintings. Cassius set down his bread and spoke with the careful formality of someone navigating emotionally dangerous territory, telling the twins that he cared for Isla deeply, but would not assume her feelings or pressure her into anything. And then he turned to her directly and asked, "Would you consider courtship?" Isla's fear spilled out in a rush of words, explaining that she was a former servant while he was king, that she was a new vampire barely understanding her nature while he was ancient and powerful, that the imbalance terrified her because she did not want to be someone he felt obligated to protect, or someone who agreed with him just because of his authority. Cassius's counter was immediate and certain, his voice carrying the conviction of truth, tested and proven. You've dictated terms to me since the day we met. You've never been afraid to tell me I'm wrong. That's not a power imbalance, that's partnership. Isla looked at him and felt the truth-binding confirm his sincerity, felt how much he valued her willingness to challenge him, and spoke words she had been holding back for months. I love you. I've been terrified to say it because I didn't want to be another thing you feel obligated to protect. Cassius's confession came with the vulnerability of someone offering his heart without armor or defense. You protect me. My heart, my children, my kingdom. Let me love you not from obligation, but choice. The kiss happened finally after months of almost, and nearly, and not quite, witnessed by delighted twins who cheered in sign language and made exaggerated romantic gestures that suggested they had been waiting for this moment far longer than was probably appropriate. When Cassius and Isla finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless despite limited vampire need for air, they were smiling, and the twins were signing demands for details about the wedding they were already planning. They talked about the future over cinnamon bread that tasted exactly like Elena's recipe, discussed the twins' continued growth and education, the kingdom's stabilization after the crisis of succession and betrayal, the certainty that new threats would come, because power always attracted challenges, but the knowledge that they would face everything together as a family, forged through choice, and tested by fire. Cassius took a bite of bread and smiled genuinely for the first time in 200 years, the expression transforming his face from ancient and austere to something warmer and more human, and Isla felt her heart clench with love for this complicated man who had learned to live again. Isla signed to the twins. What should we bake next? Ilara's response was immediate and enthusiastic. A wedding cake. Everyone laughed, the sound filling the kitchen where this entire improbable story had begun, and for that moment, everything was perfect and whole and exactly as it should be. Outside the palace walls, far from the laughter and the love and the domestic peace of the royal family, a cloaked figure stood in shadows reading a newspaper with the headline, Vampire King's Heirs Officially Recognized in bold print across the front page. The figure smiled, an expression that carried no warmth or joy and whispered to the empty air, "The game begins again." The newspaper was folded to reveal an older headline beneath, yellowed with age but still legible. "Last of Renwick, Hunter clan presumed dead." The figure's hand bore a ring that caught the moonlight, silver etched with symbols that marked it unmistakably as Renwick family heritage. And in the distance, the palace stood bright and warm against the darkness, unaware that old wars never truly ended, but only paused between battles, waiting for new players to take up ancient grudges and transform them into fresh violence. But inside the kitchen, surrounded by flour and laughter and the people who had become her family, Isla Renwick felt only joy and hope and the absolute certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together, and that made all the difference in the world.